One of my favorite things to do in the world is to look at and read an orchestral score. Here I have Rigoletto by Giuseppe Verdi. But almost any orchestrated classical piece, I really enjoy looking at the score because it's a little imagination. You can look and the music becomes alive through how it's written on the page. And if you're listening to something and you think, oh wow, that's a great effect, or I love how that was written, you can look and see exactly how it was done. Here he's written for flute, piccolo, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, horns, trumpet, trombone, cimbasso, timpani, percussion, and the string section, and the soloist. It's all right there, and you can see exactly how he set everything up to sound on the page. Unfortunately, Brian Wilson never really got into writing things out. Kind of dabbled in it, and his friends, his musician friends, would help him kind of set things up. But he, by and large, preferred to sing the parts to the musicians one by one to build an arrangement. So when I hear something in a Beach Boys track that I think is really cool, I can't look it up. Unlike, say, if you're a Jan and Dean fan and you hear something cool, Jan Berry wrote his scores out. Brian Wilson didn't. So for me to be able to get the experience of looking at a Brian Wilson score, I have to go in and figure it out myself. Here's a little bit of my work on Let Him Run Wild. Now one day I hope to publish all of these scores. But as I work towards that, part of my task is to test my work by recreating the sounds that I hear as an exercise in sort of verifying the correctness of what I'm hearing. So to do that, I recreate everything that Brian put together in the studio on my own. And I thought today I would just do a little overview of the instruments I'm using to recreate Summer Days and Summer Nights. And we're just gonna kind of talk about the arsenal and I'll just show you how much stuff you need to make a record. One thing that I really want to express in this series is that making music at this time, and this holds true now, but especially before you could make a Grammy award-winning record only in your bedroom on a computer, you had to go into a room and you had to have all this physical stuff to make a record. We've got this huge thing of wood, metal, all these guitars. It's an actual physical, sensual experience of these objects that exist in space. And I think that that's a real investment that music doesn't always have. And I think that while it's not a necessary component of good music, it certainly is an enhancing factor. When you have all this real stuff that human beings work with on a physical level to create the music, I think there's something special about that. So that's why I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money and sacrificed a lot of my personal life to bring all these instruments into my home, to learn to play them, to recreate some of these sounds. So hopefully I can pass along what really gets me going about Brian Wilson's music and other people's music who were similarly innovative, although I think Brian was kind of the best. So let's have a look at the instruments. So we're talking about the instrumentation on Summer Days and Summer Nights. And as you may know, the Beach Boys still played a fair amount of their own backing tracks on that. And when they were in the studio, they certainly had their go-to equipment. But Summer Days and Summer Nights was a little different because Carl's Jaguar and his first Rickenbacker were stolen while they were on tour. And so he was kind of in a transitionary phase. On stage, he used Fender 12. It was a prototype Fender 12 from January, February, possibly some of March, before he got his second Rickenbacker, which he then used pretty much through the whole era. Now, I'd love if somebody can disprove this, but I think that between Carl's Jaguar getting stolen and when his new Guild Starfire 6 shows up, I'm not sure that he had another 6-string fill-in. I think he was just using the Fender 12. So it's possible that when he had to record 6-string on record, that he used Al's Stratocaster, because Al really wasn't using it much in this period anyway in the studio. Certainly on stage he did. But it's very possible that Carl just used Al's Strat for Summer Days and Summer Nights stuff. Brian, of course, would have played Fender P bass when he was playing bass, which he does a couple times on Summer Days. And we'll talk about the drums later. Now, as you also may recall, this is the time when Brian really started to bring in a lot of studio musicians. Oh, I should comment about acoustic guitars too. Girl Don't Tell Me is kind of an acoustic heavy track, and Carl played a 6-string acoustic. Ooh, that's very badly out of tune. And a 12-string acoustic. And the 12-string acoustic also makes an appearance on Then I Kissed Her. So that's the boy stuff. Now, like I was saying, studio guitarists were becoming more and more the norm, and we had kind of a core of Jerry Cole, Howard Roberts, some Billy Strange, although Billy Strange ended up being a tambourinist for a lot of this because of a hand injury. But these guys would have brought in their own guitars, and as Brian was starting to get into the 12-string, it seems like most session guitarists favored the Fender 12, but there are other options out there which we'll talk about more in future episodes. Seems like session pros didn't really use Rickenbackers unless they were really asked to ape the bird sound. That sort of, it just wasn't that popular of a guitar for session people. And session people really liked Telecasters. That was by far the most used electric guitar by the likes of Tedesco, Jerry Cole, Howard Roberts had this Tele, not this exact Tele, but one that looks like it. But it's possible they used Strats and Jaguars as well. And session guys liked to use archtop guitars, archtop acoustics, a little tighter sound, a little more projection for the mics. It's not to say you don't see a Dreadnought or concert style guitars, little Martins, but by and large, you're hearing archtop acoustic guitars on Beach Boys records when you're hearing session guitarists play acoustic guitar. Now, as for basses, Summer Days is a little bit of Brian playing bass, a little bit of Al, and then increasingly we see Carol Kay get invited in to play bass, because Ray Pullman was out running the Shindig house band during this time. So Carol kind of makes her way into the core band, and she would play Fender Precision bass, as you see here. But at the same time, the 6-string bass was increasingly something Brian was interested in exploring. Now, the original 6-string bass is this Dan Electro 6-string. I have a video just about this kind of guitar, if you want to watch that. But it's tuned like a guitar, only an octave low. It has a short neck, so just a short little neck, which affects the tone, makes it a little snappier, a little looser. And this, we start to hear this bass being used more and more, and it would kind of come to its apotheosis on Pet Sounds and Smile when it really became a showcase bass in its own right. Now it's possible that people in LA were using the Fender version of this. This is a Fender 6. Actually, it's a Squier 6. I haven't seen too many photographs of people using these in the studio. Glenn Campbell uses one on TV. It really is a pretty good sounding instrument, but the Dano is was known for what it did. So I don't think Fender 6s took up as much sort of real estate. Now, let's talk about the piano. Brian Wilson's primary instrument, the piano, was the backbone of most of his compositions, and in most Beach Boys recordings you'll hear piano doing something, whether it's a bass line, or pounding out a rhythm. Piano's almost always there. They had access to baby grand pianos like this, upright pianos, tack pianos, electric pianos like we see here, although mine is not what they had. They used Wurlitzers and Hohner pianettes, and then of course organs. My organ is elsewhere, and I think you know what a Hammond organ looks like, so I won't show you that. And then we don't see it during this album, but next album, Pet Sounds, we're going to see a lot of harpsichord as Brian starts to really like the sound of that. He used it on I Get Around and When I Grow Up, but then kind of backed off for a little while. And then it shows back up on Pet Sounds in a pretty significant way. So, let's talk about another kind of bass, string bass, upright bass, contrabass. I want to really emphasize, the physical commitment to playing this thing and lugging this thing around to get a sound is really impressive. It's not easy to be a string bassist and carry your instrument around, but it really adds an almost intangible dimension to the bass line sounds. On summer days, it's more of a doubling instrument, pretty much just doubling the electric bass. But as time goes on, we find the string bass getting more and more independent lines, and doing different things than just following the rest of the bass line. Although, for mine, there's no better sound than a picked Fender bass doubling string bass, because it's got just this full spectrum sound of low end, high end. It's perfect, which is why they did it. All right, let's turn to horns now. Brian, from the very beginning, thought of the saxophone as a quintessential rock and roll instrument, and he used it all the time. Started off maybe by using a single tenor when Mike would play, and then later on he'd hire Steve Douglas and Jay Migliore to play perhaps tenor and baritone together. And on the Today album, we start to get saxophone trios on things like Please Let Me Wonder or In the Back of My Mind. But for Summer Days and Summer Nights, we really start to see a full horn section. Baritone sax, played by Jay, Steve Douglas, Plas Johnson on tenors, and then he starts to bring in a trumpet, Roy Catton. So this is B-flat piston trumpet, and it starts to become a part of Brian's regular horn section. Let 'Em Run Wild, Salt Lake City, are sort of the entry points. And then it becomes a staple of the horn section through Pet Sounds. And then when Smile comes around, Brian's kind of learned what a trumpet can do and writes for it more trumpety, like in Wonderful, Child is the Father of the Man, etc. Now, while Brian definitely used the tenor and baritone saxes most in the sax family, there's the bari, there's the tenor. He would occasionally use other members of the family, and we see an alto sax on Sherry, on the studio musician version of Sherry. At least Brian calls out an alto by name. And in later years, we see a soprano sax on Good Vibrations, and a lot of saxes on something like Transcendental Meditation. But the really cool addition to the sax family that we see for Summer Days and Summer Nights is the bass sax, which I don't have. But it's a great example of how Brian used instruments because of their intrinsic qualities rather than picking some instrument to use just to use. He always loved the sound of saxophones playing a bass line. But as he continued to compose, he discovered that the baritone didn't go down low enough to double some of the bass lines he wanted to double. So I assume at some point he asked somebody, hey, is there a sax that goes down lower than that? And they said, yeah, there's a bass sax. And he said, bring that in. And so we see a bass sax on California Girls, some other, well, I'm drawing a blank now, but we see it. Little Girl I Once Knew. It shows up on Sloop John B later. It's on Pet Sounds. Yeah, so the bass saxophone is a very important member of the sax family that I don't have. And on that note, if you feel like helping me get a bass saxophone, you can donate to my Beach Boys research instrument cause at my website, www.joshlyn.com. I appreciate any support that you feel like giving me to continue pursuing these academic, hands-on studies of popular music and the Beach Boys. I would really like to have a bass saxophone to show you how that fits into the whole scheme, and it's something I've been working towards for a long time. So if you feel like contributing, that'd be awesome. Otherwise, we'll get our hands on it when we get our hands on it. Dennis played some drums on Summer Days and Summer Nights, but Hal Blaine was there for most of the sessions and would continue to be Brian's main man on the drums, along with people like Earl Palmer. My drum setup is fairly similar to what Hal had. All of the sizes are the same. The kick drum, rack tom, floor tom are the same sizes as Hal's. The cymbal setup is relatively similar. And yeah, here we are. It's funny because Brian really reduced the drum set to a very simple backbone rhythmic instrument. And so much of the Beach Boys drumming is just Hal doing. But that's what a Brian Wilson song needs. While we're down here, I'll show you a couple of my amps. I use the Fender Bassman here for all of my Fender bass work, and usually the Dano and Fender 6 strings I'll put through there too. My Carvin tube amp I got in the early 90s, I think. So it's coming up on 30-something years old. No, that can't be right. I guess it is. I'm old. And it's a nice little tube amp. A little higher wattage than the Fender amps had in the studio. I think it's 50 watts, and something like a Fender Deluxe was 30, 25 maybe. So it can get pretty loud, but if you keep the volume low, it sounds pretty good. And Brian was sending a lot of guitars direct at this time, so amps were not used as much as they had been, but the amp certainly never went away, and there's always some guitar going through an amp on all the Beach Boys records. Got a spare Jazz Master here, and here's one last look at the drum set. You can see that I use handkerchiefs for muting. You just kind of have to dial it in for every song to get it right, how much muting there is, but they really did like a fairly dead drum sound without a lot of long decay. So that's what these handkerchiefs are for. If you're a percussionist called to a Brian Wilson session in 1965, you better have a box or a bag of tricks, which is just a big collection of all kinds of percussion instruments. Got castanets, cabasa, guiro, slapstick, claves, all kinds of stuff, and some sleigh bells. And I have a lot more percussion instruments. Oh, here's some bongos. A lot more percussion instruments scattered throughout my house. I did not feel like rounding them all up. So summer days you start to hear some more interesting auxiliary percussion, but Brian really warms up to that for Pet Sounds and Smile and Beyond, where almost every track has something interesting. That's not to say Summer Days doesn't have good percussion. It's got woodblocks and tambourines, and there's plenty of that happening, but it's not quite as developed as later on. Summer Days also sees continuing development of Brian's writing for more orchestral instruments. While he'd do more elaborate string productions in Pet Sounds and Smile and later, he did start to write for proper string sections on Summer Days. Summer Means New Love. There's a nice string section with viola and violin. And Summer Means New Love also has a French horn. And I think Brian was still kind of finding his feet with this stuff. And like I've been saying, Pet Sounds sees the fruition of his experimentation when he starts really writing for proper string quartets. Of course, the horn makes a very famous return for God Only Knows, and it's hard to imagine any other instrument playing that part. So it was an important stage of development for Brian to start fiddling around with these more serious classical instruments. So that's the tour. I've just shown you the building blocks of how Brian Wilson orchestrated the Summer Days and Summer Nights album. And I can't wait to get into each individual production. Haven't exactly decided what I'm going to do in terms of presenting, but I think there'll be something like a video on the music, and then a video on how the music was executed through the orchestration, and I'll show you the specific instruments used on each song and take you sort of instrument by instrument through the arrangements, show you what they're all playing and how it contributes to the whole. And I hope that will be interesting. I'm increasingly going to use my website, www.joshlyn.com, to accompany these videos with some writing, some documentation, some of the transcriptions, the music, a little extra detail. So check out my website if you feel like donating to the channel. I am so grateful for people that have done that in the past, and will be grateful if you care to help the channel out financially. Obviously, this is not an inexpensive endeavor and has cost me almost everything. So anyway, think about it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. We're going to be breaking down Help Me Rhonda in extreme detail and just continue sort of chronologically through the Summer Days recording sessions. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.